They came with fleets that blocked out the sun. Empires older than Earth's continents, convinced humanity would surrender like the rest. But we were born in fire, raised in defiance, and forged in the chaos of our own brutal history. They expected obedience. What they got was a war no one survived unchanged. The world had long speculated about life beyond the stars, but no prediction prepared humanity for how it truly arrived. It wasn't a radio signal or a probe drifting through the solar system. It was a silence, deep and heavy, that fell over every satellite channel, every astronomical observatory, and every defense network simultaneously. One moment, the skies were empty. The next, they were full. The fleet entered orbit without warning. Ships the size of cities, glistening with alloys unknown to human science, hung motionless above Earth like tombstones. They didn't fire. They didn't respond to transmissions. They simply waited. Around the world, people froze in disbelief, fear flooding the collective consciousness faster than any military could react. Religions erupted with interpretations. Markets collapsed in hours. Governments scrambled to understand what they were dealing with. Within days, every major power had come together. Hostile borders ignored. Long-standing enemies suddenly allies under a common fear. The aliens finally spoke on the fourth day. Their message echoed in every language and on every screen simultaneously. They claimed to be the Korthari Dominion, an empire older than Earth's atmosphere, forged in cold stars and bound by absolute order. Their offer was blunt. Surrender, and humanity would be spared. Resist, and Earth would be purged, its biosphere sterilized and archived as a failed species experiment. Panic turned to paralysis. Earth's leaders met behind locked doors and digital fortresses. The dominant thought among them was survival. The Korthari had crushed hundreds of civilizations. Their history of conquest stretched so far back that some galactic records refer to Earth's sun as a newborn star. There was no point in resistance. The mathematical odds were obliterating. But something strange began happening outside the halls of power. In the streets of war-torn countries, in refugee camps and underground bunkers, and in forgotten military bases from abandoned wars. There was a different feeling. It wasn't hope. It wasn't confidence. It was a deep, primal defiance. The kind that lives in species that evolved through fire, famine, plague, and their own worst impulses. Humanity had always been fractured, but also had a habit of becoming incredibly dangerous when backed into a corner. The United Nations dissolved itself within 48 hours, replaced by something new. The Terran Defense Accord, a unified global command with one mission: resist. Old rivalries were buried beneath nuclear bunkers. Military scientists, hackers, insurgents, and former enemies pooled everything they had. The first strike wouldn't come from space. It would come from Earth's mind. Unpredictable, savage, and unrelenting. Humanity sent a diplomatic ship anyway. A gesture, a warning, a test. It left Earth quietly, crewed by veterans and linguists. It never returned. Not a signal, not a fragment of wreckage. The Korthari made their intentions clear. There would be no peace, no negotiation, only kneeling or extinction. What the Korthari failed to understand was that kneeling was not part human design. Submission had always come with resistance. Even in slavery, humans had revolted. Even in hopeless odds, they had fought. Even when death was certain, they had stood their ground, bleeding and cursing until the last breath. The invaders had miscalculated. They believed humanity's internal chaos would make it easy to crush. In truth, it made humanity immune to fear. Underground factories activated for the first time in decades. Satellites were reprogrammed to hijack the invaders' communications. Entire cities were evacuated, not in fear, but to prepare them as decoys and traps. Propaganda, crafted with AI and old-school psychological warfare, began leaking into space. Human creativity became its own weapon. Memes, art, music, stories, all laced with a message. We are not what you think. And across the stars, others began to take notice. The galaxy was watching. Many species had bowed quickly to the Korthari, believing resistance was futile. But now they were seeing something different, something illogical, something uniquely human. The world knew what was coming. This would not be a war of territory or politics. It would be survival through defiance. A statement carved into the stars not through diplomacy, but through fire and blood. The first contact had already failed, but the first act of war was still unwritten. And when the skies finally began to burn, humanity wasn't hiding. It was waiting. The Korthari Dominion had not encountered meaningful resistance in over 3 millennia. Their empire was a machine, cold, calculating, and devastatingly efficient. It had expanded across galactic arms with precision, not rage. Subjugation was not an emotional event for them. It was procedure. Planets were not conquered in fire, but smothered in inevitability. Their victims typically capitulated before the first orbital vessel deployed. It was not merely the power of their fleet that crushed civilizations. It was the weight of certainty that nothing could stop it. The Dominion strategy was built on a simple equation: fear over hope, order over chaos, logic over instinct. Empires that resisted were used as cautionary examples, their ruins left intact in the stars as monuments to arrogance. But most never fought back. Once the Korthari arrived, submission became a biological reflex. Kneel, adapt, survive. When Earth did not kneel, the initial response from the Dominion was not alarm. It was confusion. This species had no unified government, no planet-wide infrastructure, no interstellar capabilities, and only a rudimentary grasp of artificial intelligence. Worse, its biosphere was chaotic, its history drenched in blood. To the Korthari, humans appeared to be a primitive race on the edge of self-destruction. Their refusal to obey seemed not rebellious, but illogical. But even the Dominion, for all its hubris, retained observers and analysts, those whose job was to catalog anomalies. It was one of these scholars, buried deep within the ranks of the Dominion's bureaucratic caste, who raised the first internal alert. Earth, he warned, did not follow the usual path. It had not achieved peace through unity, nor growth through cooperation. Its progress was a result of friction, competition, and self-inflicted chaos. Its history was unique. Unlike most species that had reached space through global consensus or evolutionary equilibrium, humanity had clawed its way forward through warfare, political fractures, and ceaseless ideological struggle. Where other civilizations advanced after millennia of peace, Earth had exploded into space barely a century after fighting 2 global wars back-to-back. The Dominion had mistaken disunity for weakness. In truth, Earth's divisions had made it stronger, adaptable, unpredictable, and impossible to model. The warning was ignored. Strategic advisors within the Korthari fleet insisted the human response was nothing more than a last flailing attempt at dignity. They believed Earth's mobilization would collapse under its own weight. And yet, early probes returned concerning data. Human military patterns were erratic and unorthodox. While most species aligned their tactics with technology, humanity leaned on improvisation and redundancy. Their vehicles were outdated, but endlessly modified. Their communications were decentralized but resilient. Every base, every bunker, every unit operated under the assumption that command could fall at any moment, and contingency plans extended beyond logic. More disturbingly, human morale was not only high, it was infectious. Communications intercepted from Earth were not full of despair, but fury. Civilian broadcasts, independent media, and underground pirate signals all pulsed with the same message: resistance at any cost. And they weren't just broadcasting to Earth. They were beaming their defiance into space. It was the first time in centuries the Korthari had seen defiance become a cultural export. What concerned the Dominion even more was that these transmissions were reaching occupied systems. In quiet corners of the galaxy, enslaved species began to react, not with rebellion, not yet, but with curiosity. They watched Earth not as a doomed world, but as a symbol. If a fractured, war-scarred planet could look extinction in the eye and scream, what did that say about everyone else who had bowed in silence? Some Korthari scholars proposed immediate planetary annihilation. Others argued that destroying Earth without understanding it might fracture the Dominion's aura of inevitability. If Earth became a martyr, it could inspire future insurrections. It had to be broken in a way that was total, psychological, and public. And so a new plan was formed. The Dominion would not simply destroy Earth. They would invade it, suppress it, and turn it into a monument to submission. Every major city would be conquered and repurposed. Human leaders would be paraded before the galaxy, broken and obedient. Earth would not be allowed to die a heroic death. It would be displayed as a conquered beast, silencing any whispers of resistance across the stars. But as the Korthari fleet prepared its next moves, they failed to realize that every second of delay allowed Earth to adapt. Humanity was no longer fighting for survival. It was fighting for an idea. And ideas, once released into the stars, are far harder to kill than people. Across Earth, a transformation began, not just in governments or militaries, but in the psyche of humanity itself. The arrival of the Korthari Dominion had unified the planet in a way no political system ever could. What centuries of diplomacy, war, and ideology had failed to accomplish, the threat of annihilation did in mere days. Borders blurred. Flags lost meaning. Languages became secondary. What mattered now was survival, not just of a species, but of a principle. Humanity had always been fractured, but its greatest strength had never been order. It had been chaos, and its ability to harness that chaos into innovation. Where the Korthari operated through strict hierarchy and strategic rigidity, humans thrived in asymmetry. The Dominion expected coordinated, conventional resistance. What they got was something else entirely. All across the planet, unconventional tactics began to emerge. Guerrilla thinkers, black hat hackers, out-of-the-box engineers, and retired war veterans were pulled into action. They were not chosen for their obedience, but for their unpredictability. Defense planning was decentralized intentionally. Civilian groups began forming independent resistance cells, sometimes even without government approval. The Terran Defense Accord simply let them operate. Control was traded for creativity. It was messy, but it worked. Old military tech was pulled from decommissioned bunkers, refitted, and weaponized with newer technologies. Drones once used for commercial delivery were turned into mobile sensor swarms. Decommissioned satellites were hacked, refocused, and synced into an independent orbital network. AIs originally built for gaming simulations were repurposed to model alien movement patterns using sparse data and human intuition. In days, Earth had created a chaotic, ever-changing defense grid that no Korthari algorithm could predict. Even more powerful than the tech was the message that began to spread. Humanity wasn't just preparing for war, it was broadcasting it. Every act of resistance, every training exercise, every rallying cry was recorded and sent into space, not just to intimidate the Korthari, but to inspire others who might be watching. Earth became the center of a propaganda campaign unlike any in galactic history. But this propaganda wasn't fake. It was raw, real, and human. The phrase, "We were never meant to kneel," appeared first in graffiti across ruined urban centers, then in military briefings, then on encrypted broadcasts picked up in Korthari-occupied zones. It became a symbol, more powerful than any flag, more resonant than any anthem. Entire cities began painting across rooftops large enough to be seen from orbit. Children chanted it in shelters. Dying soldiers whispered it through shattered radios. The effect rippled beyond Earth. In distant corners of the galaxy, enslaved species began pirating human broadcasts. They saw a planet refusing to submit, a species born in violence, but using that violence to stand. Alien dissidents began echoing human slogans in coded transmissions. Rebellion hadn't started yet, but the idea had been planted. The Korthari took notice. Dominion leadership debated how best control the growing threat of psychological contagion. Earth's military might was minimal compared to theirs, but the cultural defiance posed an unpredictable variable. The longer humanity resisted, the more time other species had to watch and question their own submission. Silence had always been the foundation of Korthari rule. Earth was shattering it in real time. In response, the Korthari initiated cyber attacks meant to cripple human communications, but they found themselves in a digital battlefield unlike any they had encountered. Human networks were fragmented and outdated, impossible to centralize and hard to destroy. Civilian programmers, independent AI, and rogue hackers turned the digital war into a chaotic hellscape for Korthari infiltrators. Information warfare became humanity's first true victory, not by overpowering, but by overwhelming. More radical measures were proposed by the Korthari High Caste: planetary blackouts, surgical orbital strikes, cultural erasure protocols. But every action they considered came with a risk. The more brutal the suppression, the more the galaxy would see Earth not as defiant, but as heroic. And so they delayed. And with every delay, Earth prepared. Mass driver installations were constructed in hidden valleys. Energy weapons were jury-rigged from mining lasers. Civilian militias trained using virtual simulations built from gaming engines. Schools became bunkers. Hospitals became command centers. Every scrap of Earth's technological past was resurrected with one purpose: survival through resistance. The most unexpected development was ideological. Religion, philosophy, and politics began to merge around a single ethos, not spiritual salvation or power, but dignity, the right to stand, the refusal to kneel. Across all belief systems, across every language and class, humanity rallied around a shared identity, not a superiority, but a stubbornness. The message was simple: we will die on our feet, not live on our knees. This was the moment Earth stopped being a target and became a symbol. It was no longer just about winning. It was about being seen. When the Korthari Dominion initiated its first kinetic offensive against Earth, they chose the moon as the staging ground. Strategically, it made sense. Its proximity to Earth made it the perfect location for a forward operations base. Its surface offered minimal resistance, no atmosphere, and no existing military infrastructure. To the Korthari, it was a blank slate, a sterile gray rock that could be repurposed without complication. In their calculations, resistance there would be non-existent. They believed that if humanity couldn't defend its own satellite, it surely couldn't defend its planet. They were only half right. Earth did not try to hold the moon in traditional terms. Instead, it transformed it into a trap. Long before the first Korthari dropships touched down, the Terran Defense Accord had predicted the strategic value of Luna. The preparations were carried out in silence. Coded transmissions relayed instructions to international agencies that didn't officially exist. Private space mining companies were nationalized overnight. Civilian satellites were reprogrammed to blind enemy sensors. Supplies and personnel were launched into orbit under the guise of scientific experiments and commercial payloads. Everything was concealed beneath the cover of orbital debris and solar interference. By the time the Korthari landed, the moon had already been laced with explosives, kinetic railguns, thermal traps, and signal jamming systems buried deep beneath its regolith. Dozens of autonomous drone pods, powered by solar-charged batteries and controlled by decentralized AI, waited in complete silence. More importantly, Earth had stationed its most unconventional soldiers there, veterans of asymmetric warfare, engineers trained in zero-gravity combat, and scientists who had turned survival into science. The battle began with precision. Korthari forces deployed formations optimized for atmospheric environments, expecting little resistance. But the moon did not respond like a traditional battlefield. It offered no front lines, no trenches, no defensive walls. Instead, it swallowed them. Mines detonated beneath their feet, not from pressure but from electromagnetic signatures. Railguns buried under several meters of rock, fire from angles impossible to detect. Drones emerged from lunar caves and stormed exposed supply lines in complete silence. Human forces didn't engage in stand-up fights. They harassed, vanished, and struck again. The Dominion was unprepared for the psychological toll. Their soldiers, bred and trained in order and control, were not accustomed to chaos. The moon offered no cover and no air for sound. The silence made every loss feel like disappearance. Sensors failed regularly, and electronic jamming rendered high-tech coordination ineffective. Even their emergency fallback protocols became liabilities, as Earth's hackers had already infiltrated and reverse-engineered parts of their command interface. But it wasn't the tech that broke them. It was the relentlessness. Korthari forces expected Earth to throw everything into a single, desperate defense, to collapse quickly once losses mounted. Instead, they encountered a force that treated the battle not as survival, but as sport. Human troops rotated through underground bunkers, launching unpredictable ambushes, using minimal oxygen and maximum brutality. Injured fighters refused extraction. Dying soldiers armed self-destruct charges instead of requesting aid. It became clear to the invaders. This wasn't just offense. It was sacrifice. For the first time in centuries, The Dominion lost a battlefield engagement. The significance went beyond the moon itself. The Korthari were not merely defeated. They were humiliated. Their tactical assumptions failed. Their psychological superiority fractured. Their precision, the backbone of their dominance, had been rendered useless by what they called adaptive chaos. In a confidential internal report, one Korthari commander described a human strategy as illogical, suicidal, and horrifyingly effective. The capture of a high-ranking Dominion officer during the skirmishes compounded the defeat. The prisoner was not merely held. He was studied, recorded, and made into a message. Footage of his captivity was transmitted not just across Earth, but into the stars. The officer was treated humanely, but firmly. He was shown the cities he'd planned to erase, the civilians he'd aimed to enslave, and the resistance that had emerged without invitation or command. The transmission ended with a simple message. We do not bow. We do not break. We bleed and we rise. The impact of the moon victory echoed far beyond the solar system. To the enslaved populations under Korthari control, Earth was no longer a whisper of resistance. It was proof. A species with no interstellar travel, no advanced weaponry, and no galactic allies had not only stood against the Dominion, it had drawn blood. The myth of Korthari invincibility was broken, and with it, the silence that had kept other species obedient. Strategically, the win was minor. The Korthari still outgunned humanity by orders of magnitude, but warfare had shifted. Now, it wasn't about territory or firepower. It was about morale, about symbols, about will. The moon was no longer a rock. It was a battlefield soaked in alien blood and human defiance. And for the first time in galactic memory, the question was no longer how long Earth would last. It was how far Earth would go. The capture of a Korthari commander during the moon conflict offered humanity more than a tactical edge. It presented a rare opportunity to speak, not just to their invaders, but to the entire galaxy. Until that point, the Korthari Dominion had maintained strict control over interstellar communications. Most enslaved civilizations had no access to unfiltered data, their histories rewritten and their rebellions buried in silence. The Dominion's dominance rested not only on military power, but on total control of the narrative. No one had ever dared to challenge that monopoly until Earth. With the captured officer secured, Earth's underground intelligence networks initiated a bold plan. One that would weaponize words, images, and truth with the same intensity it had wielded bullets. The Dominion's internal systems had proven difficult to breach directly, but Earth's cyber divisions had found a weakness. The passive data channels used for educational propaganda in Korthari control systems. These seemingly benign frequencies, once hijacked, could reach tens of millions of devices spread across dozens of enslaved worlds. And they were rarely monitored in real time. The Terran defense accord greenlit the operation immediately. What followed was not merely a broadcast, it was a declaration of identity. The video transmission opened not with the prisoner, but with Earth itself. It showed cities in ruin and civilians training in fields under blackened skies. It showed burned flags being replaced with the Earth insignia, resistance graffiti on walls, and families rebuilding underground communities. It featured raw, unfiltered footage of the moon battle, complete with Korthari corpses and victorious human soldiers dragging wounded comrades through regolith dust. There was no voiceover, no music, just truth. And at the heart of it, the captured commander, alive, shackled but untouched, was shown being fed, treated medically, and even spoken to in Korthari dialects by human linguists. The final image of the transmission was simple. It showed the words, translated in every major galactic language. We were never meant to kneel. Then silence. No threat. No demands. Just a statement. The ripple effect was immediate. The Korthari Dominion scrambled to trace the source and suppress the signal, but it was too late. In the time it took to respond, millions of individuals across Dominion-controlled territories had seen it. More importantly, they had recorded it. And once truth is seen, it cannot be unseen. Underground communication hubs across several occupied planets began sharing fragments. Symbols from the broadcast, the Earth insignia, the resistance slogan, began appearing in forbidden artwork on digital forums, and even scrawled in alien blood, during scattered prison riots. The Dominion attempted damage control. They labeled the broadcast a hoax, a psychological operation orchestrated by extinct rebels. But it didn't matter. Earth had done something no civilization had managed in thousands of years. It had broken the silence. The Empire's illusion of total control had cracked, and the galaxy had caught a glimpse of something radical. Hope. Earth's leadership understood the moment's value. They launched additional broadcasts in the days that followed, each one tailored to a different aspect of human culture: music, sports, literature, history, war. Not as superiority, but as solidarity. The message was consistent. Humanity was not perfect, but it was free-thinking, relentless, and unafraid to suffer for its principles. It didn't seek domination. It sought dignity. For all, the decision to frame the broadcast not as anti-Korthari propaganda, but as a cultural invitation, proved revolutionary. Entire species, long conditioned to fear rebellion, found themselves drawn to the strange, defiant planet that refused to break. Some began creating their own underground content inspired by Earth. Resistance songs, emblems, masks. In quiet corners of the galaxy, the phrase, "We were never meant to kneel," was translated into hundreds of dialects and painted onto walls. Etched into skin, whispered in secret. The Dominion responded with force. Crackdowns on suspected sympathizers intensified. Planets experienced purges. Cultural artifacts were destroyed. But the more the Dominion tightened its grip, the more emboldened the resistance became. Fear was no longer working. The myth of invincibility had collapsed under the weight of a single transmission. Back on Earth, the effect was just as profound. The success of the broadcast energized populations reeling from loss and sacrifice. Volunteers surged. Civilian industries repurposed themselves for war support. Entire city districts, once neutral, turned themselves into resistance manufacturing hubs. For the first time in modern history, humans felt they were not merely defending themselves. They were leading something greater. The war had expanded beyond the boundaries of Earth. It had become ideological. It had become viral. And it had all started with a single decision: to speak when the enemy thought silence was inevitable. What Earth understood, and the Dominion had forgotten, was that information was a weapon as powerful as any missile. When shaped by pain, conviction, and truth, it could spread faster than fire. It could reach across stars. It could awaken the enslaved. It could shake the foundations of empires built on fear. And once awakened, the galaxy would never sleep again. Following the broadcast of Defiance and the insurgent sparks it ignited across multiple star systems, the Korthari Dominion reevaluated its strategy. It no longer viewed Earth as a primitive outlier. It now recognized humanity as a contagious anomaly, an ideological infection spreading faster than military deployment could contain. The Dominion's plans shifted from occupation to eradication. Earth and all sympathetic systems would need to be isolated and crushed before Defiance became irreversible. At the center of this new plan was the Titan Gate, a massive wormhole generation array orbiting Saturn. Unlike traditional Korthari transport hubs that were cloaked or mobile, the Titan Gate had been positioned openly, arrogantly, as a show of power and certainty. Built with self-repairing alloys and defended by dozens of battle cruisers, it served as the primary channel through which Korthari reinforcements, supplies, and command fleets entered the solar system. As long as the Titan Gate remained active, Earth would remain vulnerable to endless waves of fresh enemy forces. The Terran Defense Accord knew the Titan Gate was both the Dominion's greatest strategic asset and its most fragile one. Disabling or destroying it could change the momentum of the war, perhaps even sever connection between Earth and the wider Korthari infrastructure. But the Gate was virtually invulnerable to conventional assault. No missile or mass driver strike could reach it through the orbital defense net. No stealth ship could penetrate its sensor field undetected. A frontal attack would be suicide. So humanity chose suicide deliberately. A multi-phase operation was conceived under the codename Grave Dust. It would not rely on superior firepower, nor on cutting-edge technology. Instead, it would exploit the very thing the Korthari could never understand: human unpredictability and willingness to die for a symbolic blow. The plan called for outdated Earth ships, retired warcraft from old superpowers, retrofitted with improvised stealth coatings, and loaded with obsolete but heavily shielded fusion cores. These ships were to be piloted manually by volunteers, selected not for their rank or skill, but for their refusal to retreat. The Dominion detected the launch but misread it. The slow, low-emission crafts appeared as debris fields or civilian relics. They let them pass, confident that Earth would never mount a meaningful strike against such a fortified asset. By the time Dominion forces realized the incoming wave was a kamikaze squadron, it was already too late. The first ships were shot down in rapid succession. But that had never been the goal. The later waves maneuvered through the wreckage of their fallen comrades, using the debris as cover. They slipped through the defense perimeter and closed in on the gate's central ring structure. The final vessel, piloted by an anonymous figure whose name would be remembered across centuries, collided with the gate's core at the precise moment when a transport cycle was opening. The resulting detonation did not merely destroy the vessel. It destabilized the wormhole field while a carrier fleet was mid-transition. The spatial rupture created a cascading failure through the ring's internal architecture. Energy intended to bend space was forced inward, causing a chain reaction that imploded the entire gate assembly. The Titan gate was gone. In one act of suicidal brilliance, Earth had severed the Dominion's direct link to the solar system. No reinforcements, no supplies, no retreat. The Korthari fleet already in system was now trapped, stranded light years from their nearest stronghold. What had been a symbol of their superiority had become their prison. The shock reverberated through the galaxy. To the Dominion's high caste, the gate's destruction was an incomprehensible breach of protocol. They had never lost a wormhole gate in open war. It was more than a military setback. It was a spiritual rupture in the dogma of inevitability that underpinned their empire. Orders were scrambled, blame cascaded. For the first time in memory, the Korthari hierarchy experienced indecision. To enslave populations across the galaxy, the fall of the Titan Gate became legend. No one had ever struck a blow that deep into the heart of the Dominion's infrastructure. Earth had not merely resisted. It had reached into the stars and torn out a vital artery of its enemy. The message was clear. If humans could bring down a gate, then others could do more than whisper rebellion. They could act. Within days, resistance movements and occupied systems began to mobilize. Secret cells activated. Sabotage increased. Even Dominion loyalist species began to question their alliances. The illusion of unchallengeable dominance had shattered. On Earth, the cost of the operation was mourned, but not in despair. The names of the fallen were etched into the lunar surface by robotic engravers, and their images broadcast to the stars. They were no longer soldiers. They were martyrs, icons of resistance, proof that humanity would burn down the sky before surrendering. More importantly, their sacrifice had bought Earth time. With the reinforcements cut off, the local Korthari fleet was now on the defensive. Earth could regroup, plan, counterattack, and the galaxy, once silent, was beginning to speak back. With the Titan Gate annihilated and the Dominion fleet cut off from reinforcements, Earth no longer stood as prey, but as a battlefield no longer beneath the Empire's reach. Yet with their path of retreat severed, the trapped Korthari forces did not collapse. They dug in, isolated and desperate. They initiated the most aggressive and brutal invasion Earth had ever faced. What had begun as an orbital suppression campaign turned into a scorched earth ground war. The Korthari fleet descended upon the planet with a singular objective: break the will of humanity before the rest of the galaxy followed its example. The invasion was not surgical. It was total. Orbital strikes razed major urban centers. Atmospheric disruptors turned skies into choking clouds of static and ash. Biomechanical infantry, engineered for planetary warfare, poured into continents like waves of living metal. There were no diplomatic channels left. There was no pretense of mercy. The Dominion came not to conquer, but to erase. But what met them on Earth's surface was not a species in hiding. It was one that had prepared. Entire cities have been hollowed out and repurposed into labyrinthine trap networks. Streets have been transformed into kill zones layered with autonomous drones, improvised mines, and electromagnetic suppression fields. Civilian populations had long been evacuated to underground strongholds built deep into mountain ranges and beneath ocean floors. Infrastructure had become weaponized architecture. Humanity had not prepared for occupation. It had engineered extinction for anyone who tried. The battles that followed were unlike anything the Dominion had encountered in its long history. The Korthari War doctrine, built around overwhelming force and rapid pacification, failed in terrain designed specifically to punish arrogance. Their superior tech faltered under Earth's magnetic interference and weather manipulation systems. Their towering warforms were ambushed in forests, drowned in collapsing swamps, and frozen in synthetic tundras designed to mirror the worst of Earth's climate extremes. Humanity's forces fought without expectation of survival. This was not a war to win territory. It was a war to deny it. Soldiers collapsed bridges beneath themselves to take down enemy transports. Fighter pilots flew into orbital strike paths to misguide enemy targeting. Medical teams doubled as saboteurs, rigging fallen hospitals to detonate when overrun. The line between military and civilian vanished. Everyone was resistance. Everything was a weapon. The turning point came during what would later be known as the Shattered Sky Offensive. A final push by the Korthari to overtake Earth's last communication grid was repelled not by direct combat, but by a global blackout protocol that triggered a full-spectrum EMP wave, sacrificing every remaining satellite and digital relay system. The blackout severed Earth's own networks, but it blinded the enemy completely. In the ensuing chaos, human ground teams launched coordinated assaults using hand signals, light pulses, and ancient analog radios. The Dominion's forces were overwhelmed not by firepower, but by sheer, incomprehensible adaptability. The Korthari command structure began to collapse. Their autonomous systems, dependent on clean signals and synchronized algorithms, failed in the electromagnetic fog. Units were cut off, leaders lost, reinforcements confused. The invincible army was reduced to scattered enclaves fighting in hostile terrain, facing a species that had turned every valley, city, and coastline into a graveyard for invaders. As the battle raged on, Earth's final broadcast was launched using deep-sea transmitters, crude but impossible to trace. It declared not victory, not peace, but perseverance. The message was sent in every known language, including Korthari. We are still standing. And the galaxy heard it. Across enslaved worlds, uprisings erupted. Dominion garrisons were overrun. Collaborators were cast down. Rebel fleets, once hidden in asteroid belts and gas giants, emerged in force. Resistance became reality. The myth of the Dominion's eternity was shattered, replaced by a singular truth. Earth had not just fought back, it had survived. In the aftermath of the ground war, what remained of the Korthari occupation force surrendered or was eradicated. There were no treaties, no formal declarations. The invaders had brought total war. Humanity had returned it without apology. Earth itself was left battered, oceans poisoned, continents scarred, skies dimmed by the ashes of 1,000 burning cities. But amidst the ruin, life endured. Rebuilding began even before the last embers cooled. Children were born underground. Crops were replanted in radioactive soil. AI constructs previously used for war began printing homes instead of weapons. And in the new world that rose from the wreckage, the phrase that had once been graffiti, then slogan, then transmission, became doctrine. We were never meant to kneel. It had started as resistance. It had become survival. Now it was legacy. The war ended not with treaties or surrender, but with silence. The Korthari fleet in the solar system was gone. Destroyed, scattered, or entombed within the ruins of a planet they failed to conquer. Their last transmission, garbled and incomplete, never asked for peace. It was a warning to their empire. Earth cannot be subdued. Then there was nothing. In the vacuum of conflict, Earth stood alone. The planet was wounded beyond calculation. Nearly half of the global surface was uninhabitable. Skies remained heavy with ash and radiation storms. Once proud cities had become hollow bones of their former selves. Yet despite the devastation, life surged in cracks. Humanity had not just survived annihilation, it had outlived its annihilators. What followed was not a celebration, but a reckoning. Reconstruction began immediately, but it was driven by more than necessity. It was an act of defiance in itself. Fields were cleared by hand. Roads were rebuilt stone by stone. Waterways, poisoned by atmospheric damage, were rerouted and filtered using makeshift devices forged in the heat of wartime ingenuity. Technology, once feared and regulated, became humanity's new prosthetic, restoring not only limbs and machines, but confidence and direction. Survivors organized not under nations, but under purpose. The Terran Defense Accord, which had begun as a wartime alliance, evolved into something greater. A united human polity built not on conquest or commerce, but resilience. It was not a government in the traditional sense. It had no capital. It had no supreme ruler. It was a decentralized network of scientists, engineers, survivors, and thinkers whose sole mission was to preserve the hard-won future and ensure Earth would never kneel again. But Earth's isolation was temporary. In the weeks that followed the last battle, signals began to reach the surface. Not warnings, not threats, invitations. Messages came from species long thought pacified under Korthari rule. Former slave worlds, distant colonies, and fragmented rebel enclaves, all broadcasting a single question. Are you still there? And Earth answered. Diplomatic channels were reestablished through repurposed deep space antennas. No one spoke of peace terms or resource exchanges. Instead, they shared methods of survival, how to filter ash-contaminated water, how to grow food under artificial suns, how to resist occupation. Earth became not a capital, but a mentor. Its story spread not as propaganda, but as curriculum. Former enemies of the Korthari found themselves drawn to the planet that had broken the cycle. Alien envoys, still bearing the marks of servitude, arrived in patched ships and makeshift transports. They came not to offer allegiance, but to learn. From Earth, they took no orders, only warnings, blueprints, and conviction that resistance was no longer suicide. It was a strategy. A coalition began to form, not power blocks or empires, but of scarred survivors, a loose assembly of worlds, united by the shared experience of surviving Dominion tyranny. No formal name was given to this alliance, but among its members, one term circulated more than any other, the Terran Accord. Not because Earth had claimed leadership, but because Earth had taught the galaxy how to lead itself. Even within the fragmented remains of the Korthari Empire, shifts began. Isolated sectors, once ruled with mechanical efficiency, fell into civil unrest. High caste members vanished or defected. Some planets declared autonomy outright. Others requested aid, not for weapons, but for guidance. Earth responded, not with fleets, but with files, medicine, and education. Where the Dominion had conquered through fear, humanity now influenced through example. But Earth did not forget. Memorials were constructed not just for humans, but for every species that had died in silence before the war began. The lunar wall, etched with the names of every known fallen resistance fighter, became the first monument visible from orbit. On Earth's surface, old battlefields were preserved as living history. Classrooms carved from ruins. Children born after the war knew no empires, only stories. They studied tactics not to glorify violence, but to understand what made humanity endure. They were taught not to hate the Korthari, but to remember why silence had been so dangerous for so long. Earth had not emerged as a superpower. It had no armada. It did not seek territory. What it held was something rarer, moral gravity. The kind that comes only from paying the ultimate price and choosing to rise anyway. Over time, the phrase that had started as graffiti became sacred doctrine across hundreds of liberated worlds. It appeared in alien alphabets, carved into temples, whispered before rebellion, and chanted after victory. We were never meant to kneel. And in that truth, Earth's legacy was sealed, not as conqueror, not as ruler, but as the spark that lit the stars. They came expecting surrender. They left with scars that will echo across galaxies. Earth stood not because it was the strongest, but because it refused to fall. If this story lit fire in you, subscribe, share, and join the resistance. Because somewhere out there, another world is waiting to rise. We were never meant to kneel. Stand with us. Hit that like button. Drop your thoughts in the comments. And turn on the bell for more tales from the Terran front. Humanity isn't done. We're just getting started.